Hi everybody. This is our class for English 221 for Wednesday, the 12th of May, and it actually happens to be our last class where we are putting closure on Othello, and I'm also talking a little bit about The Tempest and reminding you of due dates. So today would be the day that you would be submitting in your final journal, and that happens to be for Othello, if you haven't already submitted it in. And I will be getting that back to you before, or I believe I can get that back to you before the final exam and the time in which your second paper is due. And both are on the same date. Your final exam is on Monday, the 17th of May at 8 a.m. You will have 24 hours in which to do that final exam. So you need to submit in that final exam by Tuesday, the 18th at 8 a.m. And paper number 2 on either history or tragedy, if you haven't already submitted it into me, will be due on Monday as well on the 17th. And in terms of thinking about Othello, we've been discussing some of the ways that the play could be read and interpreted. And I have in my notes below just put some odds and ends that either we haven't really had much of a chance to talk about, or the Harvard lecture that I asked you to watch about Othello didn't have much of a chance to talk about. The opening scene in particular with Roderigo, Iago, and Brabantio, I think is terribly important, not only because it takes place in darkness, which sets the tone for the play, but it also gives us the truth of racism, that public and private are very, very different, that what an individual says privately is much different than the way they can portray themselves publicly in terms of social and political issues. And obviously, we see the blatant racism with Roderigo, Iago, and Brabantio right at the very beginning. So it seems appropriate that it be occurring in the dark, because they are racist, and that is a very dark and evil way of seeing the world. And Othello, as honorable as he is at the beginning of the play, says something very interesting in Act 1, Scene 3, line 93, when he's trying to justify his wooing of Desdemona. And he says, I won his, and he's talking about Brabantio's daughter. And this is a theme that we've seen throughout the course of the semester, that female is viewed as property, and whether she be the property of a father or she be the property of a husband or a combination of the two. In fact, even Desdemona talks about her divided duty in Act 1, Scene 3, line 181, the duty for her father and also the duty for her new husband. And that a woman is seen as property, a prize, or a possession. And the fact that female is objectified is perhaps one of the reasons why Othello is able to be so bestial and brutal towards female at the very ending of the play. Not that it's only Othello, all of the male characters, or I should say, many of the male characters, treat women terribly over the course of this particular play. But nevertheless, thinking about Iago, who probably is the mastermind behind everything, as I've mentioned, that he's been called Shakespeare's consummate villain, that he understands individuals' weaknesses, and in these long prose passages, which again goes to show his baser nature, and these soliloquies that help to bind us to him as audience members, so we are bound to evil in some ways. We hear his inner thoughts. And he talks about how, for instance, I hate the more, and it's thought abroad that twixt my sheets had done my office. I know not if it be true. And honestly, he doesn't care if it's true. This is just a weak rationalization for why he's engaging in the behavior he's engaging in. Just like there is a rationalization, but not a terrifically strong one, that the fact that he's been passed over for promotion could be some of the reasons for his particular behavior. Racism as well, a particular reason for his behavior. And we know how ugly and brutal Iago can be, particularly when we see him behind closed doors. One of the things that Iago is really, I think, skilled at is using language as a weapon. Remember that Iago and Othello, and actually many of the male characters in this play, are soldiers. But the war that they're fighting now is going to be within themselves and between each other rather than the war with the Turks. Again, an idea that we've seen before, something like Much Ado About Nothing. And I've oftentimes said that Much Ado About Nothing is the comedic version of Othello because there's so many similar elements within the plot in terms of questioning female chastity, the use of rumor and hearsay, the importance of reputation. But of course, in a tragedy, we will get a tragic ending. We won't get a happy resolution. And we're not going to have any kind of comedic subplots in the way that we did with even Macbeth, perhaps, if we wanted to talk about the drunken porter scene, that perhaps might give a little bit of levity, but there is no levity in Othello. Notice as well that Iago goes on and not only manipulates Othello, but he manipulates Cassio, he manipulates Roderigo, he manipulates Emilia, and he manipulates Desdemona. So he really is a master. We had talked a little bit about the idea of his ability to move the characters around almost like they're chess pieces. And it's a huge game that requires a lot of concentration and a lot of forethought. Understanding that Cassio's weakness happens to be drunkenness. So, of course, he's going to create a situation where that can be exploited. And he also knows that Roderigo's weakness is that he has lust for Desdemona. So he's going to create a situation where he can profit from that. And in fact, in a master move, he pits Cassio and Roderigo against one another, both in the beginning of the play and then towards the ending of the play. Of course, Emilia, we know, is desperate for his attention and for his affection. So he uses that to his advantage when he convinces her to get, as I've called perhaps the most famous prop in literary history, the handkerchief for him. We know, obviously, the many ways that he manipulates Othello, but even manipulating Desdemona. At one point, Desdemona actually goes to Iago for consultation, for advice, because she's so distraught about Othello's actions. And of course, in another master move, Iago convinces Cassio to ask Desdemona to plead his case so that he can be reinstated. And of course, it sounds absolutely horrible from Othello's perspective. It appears as if she's trying to protect her lover. And when Iago says, "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster, which doth mock the meat it feeds on." And this is in Act 3, Scene 3, line 165. Not only do we have a very famous phrase about the idea of jealousy as that green-eyed monster, but also the idea of meat and feeding on. And we know that in our comedies, what we're going to see is eating and banqueting in a more positive fashion. And we've seen it in a much more negative fashion in Macbeth, and the same with Othello, even with Richard II in some respects as well. And when we talk about meat, that really focuses on the idea of the physicality. And this is a play about physicality. This is a play about sexuality and about the idea that one could be honored or dishonored through sexual activity. And of course, Iago knows how to use the truth in very clever ways, as I had talked about previously. So, Act 3, Scene 3, line 206, Iago says, "She did deceive her father, marrying you," which is quite true. And we might even see that as a strength of Desdemona's, that she's able to defy her father and follow her heart, or at least not confront her father and marry Othello and follow her heart. But of course, that's turned upside down, perhaps at the very ending of the play, when she says that no one is responsible for her murder. She herself is responsible for her murder. Notice all of these lines that I'm quoting right now are coming from Act 3, Scene 3. Makes perfect sense in terms of the pinnacle of the pyramid structure of drama that we've been talking about throughout the entire semester. And we also get in line 356, Act 3, Scene 3, "I'll pour this pestilence into his ear." And this is Iago speaking about how he's going to be able to corrupt or plans to corrupt Othello. And I can't help but think of the Macbeths when we were talking about the play Macbeth, because this is very comparable to what Lady Macbeth wants to do as well. And even in Act 3, Scene 3, line 374, when Iago asks, "Are you a man?" which is very similar to what Lady Macbeth asks to Macbeth in terms of spurring on action. Maybe what's most interesting is that as much as language is used as a weapon, and this was something the Harvard lecturer talked about, at the very ending of the play, Act 5, Scene 2, line 304, Iago declares, "From this time forth, I will never speak a word." In other words, he's not going to be using his most valuable weapon. So in theory, that's supposed to negate the possibility of his danger. Now, I had mentioned something called the marriage scene, and that occurs, again, tellingly, in Act 3, Scene 3, line 453. And I wanted to read that to you. This is when ultimately Iago has convinced Othello that Desdemona has been unfaithful and that Othello needs to take action. And this begins again in Act 3, Scene 3, and this would be around line 453 or so. And Othello says, "Never, Iago, like to the Pontic Sea, whose icy current and compulsive course never feels retiring ebb, but keeps due on to the Pontonkic and the Hellespont. Even so my bloody thoughts, with violent pace, shall never look back, never ebb to humble love, till that a capable and wide revenge swallow them up." And you look at the stage directions. He kneels. "Now by yon marble heaven, in the due reverence of a sacred vow, I here engage my words." So we've got the reference to the idea of a vow, almost like a marriage vow. Iago's response is that, if we see in the stage directions, he kneels. So now both are kneeling. And Iago says, "Do not rise yet. Witness your ever-burning lights above, you elements that clip us round about. Witness that here Iago doth give up the execution of his wit, hands, heart, to wronged Othello's service. Let him command, and to obey shall be in me remorse. What bloody business ever." And then they rise. So the idea that they're kneeling and that they are exchanging vows with one another is the reason that this has been called the marriage scene. And it also is one of the other rationales that have been given for Iago's behavior. We've talked about the idea that Iago has some sexual jealousy because he is afraid that Emilia has been unfaithful with Othello. We talked about the fact that Iago has racism inherent within him when he talks about in Othello in such bestial terms at the beginning of the play. We talk about the idea of Iago's jealousy that he's been passed over for promotion by Cassio. And we've also talked about the fact that Iago enjoys evil for the sake of evil. But what we haven't talked about, and this is something that some critics have examined, is that there is some sort of sexual jealousy, not with Emilia, but with Othello. That Iago has some sort of sexual attraction to Othello and has basically lost Othello to Desdemona. And now ultimately this is his way of getting Othello back through his manipulations, and that this marriage scene is a kind of exchange of vows, both sexual as well as spiritual. And I don't know necessarily if I particularly agree with that argument, but I did want to reference that argument and note to you that that's a very important scene. In a play that's very much contemporary in the sense that it deals with lots of domestic violence issues. When you think about how Othello treats Desdemona, how he goes from first idealizing her to then thinking of her as a strumpet, a whore. And I mentioned last class that Othello is a man of absolutes. She's either completely pure or she's completely impure, and there's no in between. But we see that Othello hits her. We see that Othello insults her. And ultimately, we see Othello kill her. And as I was referencing, not that the other men in the play are particularly kind to their women, we know that Iago treats Emilia terribly. He says terrible things to her and he controls her and manipulates her. We know that ultimately Roderigo treats women terribly. We see that when he is basically trying to use Desdemona as a sexual object. And we see how Cassio treats women terribly. And that's a great scene with Bianca where basically she's asking, where have you been? Obviously she has affection for him. And he has none. He thinks of her purely as as basically a whore, as someone who's there to pleasure him, but no one that he has any kind of romantic connection with. I've always thought that Emilia's speech in Act 4, Scene 3, line 84, is not just an opportunity to talk about the way that women in Renaissance society aren't given agency, but it in my perspective, seems to be almost Shakespeare talking about the need for more equality and seemingly, in some ways, to support women's rights. Act 4, Scene 3, line 84, when Emilia says in a very brave statement, and if you think about it, in a very clear statement as well, her feelings about who men are. Perhaps her feelings are in some ways motivated from the fact that she's married to Iago. So we can only imagine, we can only imagine the kind of relationship, that they might have had with one another. But what Emilia says is, and this is in Act 4, Scene 3, line 84. Yes, a dozen, and as many to the vantage as would store the world they play for. But I do think it is their husbands' faults, if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us. Or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet have we some revenge. Let husbands know that wives have sense like them. They see and smell, and have their palates both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? I think it does. Is it frailty that thus errs? It is so too. And have not we affections, desires for sport and frailty, as men have? Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills, instruct us so. And if you think about a perhaps problematic character, someone like a Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where ultimately Oberon is able to manipulate her, I always think of this particular speech in that this might be a way of saying that Titania is basically innocent, and that ultimately any behavior she might have exhibited, whether it be the absurdity of falling in love with an ass, or perhaps the audacity of defying her husband's marriage bed, is because of the ill treatment that she has received from someone like Oberon. And we definitely see Oberon as a very negative kind of character in A Midsummer Night's Dream, very controlling and manipulative. So even though in A Midsummer Night's Dream we get our stereotypical happy ending in the sense that Oberon gets his way and Titania is willing to forgive him, I always think about this particular speech that makes the relationship seem a little bit more complex than what we might get in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But of course, A Midsummer Night's Dream being a comedy wouldn't have the level of complexity that we would find in, let's say, a tragedy. Even something like drunkenness, which you might have noticed is a theme throughout many of Shakespeare's plays. The idea that we can become drunk and overwhelmed with ambition or passion or jealousy, so that we can't necessarily think clearly anymore. So I think when we get a Cassio who is subject to drunkenness, we could say that in many ways Othello is drunk with jealousy. You know, we even see how he descends into that epileptic fit with Iago. The idea is that Othello has descended completely into the bestial and can no longer speak. And remember, that was also one of Othello's strengths. This is the way that he was able to woo Desdemona through his great stories. But Othello used language for positive as opposed to Iago, who used it for negative. Though you could say both use language to manipulate on some level. Obviously, Othello wanted to get Desdemona, and obviously Iago has lots of reasons for trying to control and manipulate others. So, in terms of thinking about the ending of the play with Othello, I've always said that many times what we see with Shakespeare is a complex ending. And when Othello says at the very end, "Remember me as one that loved not wisely but too well." The idea that we can empathize with him because he was basically filled with love, or that we can also critique him, that this is his rationalization, that he loved her so well that there wasn't any other possibility of action than the action that he engaged in. And he continues on, and this is in Act 5, Scene 2, around 344. "Then must you speak of one that loved not wisely but too well, of one not easily jealous, but being wrought, perplexed in the extreme, of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe, and one of his subdued eyes." And think about the idea of the pearl imagery and white and black, and how that's a major theme throughout this particular play. So for today's attendance question, what I thought I would ask, now that we've read two tragedies and we've read a history that sort of straddles the idea of tragedy, is asking you to respond to the question of which did you find to be the most disturbing play, Richard II, Macbeth, or Othello, and why? And the why piece is the most important piece, of course. That will be due Thursday, the 13th at 8 a.m., and that will be our last attendance question for the class. Now, I had indicated that if we had a little bit more time, perhaps a couple more weeks, we could have squeezed in another play, but I didn't want us to have to do that and sacrifice some of the time that we've spent with the previous plays, and obviously I can't add on to the semester. So this is where I talk a little bit about Shakespeare's tragic comedies, the last of his genres that are thought to have been written at the ending of Shakespeare's career. And they mix elements of tragedy, so they can be rather dark. But they also mix elements of comedy, which means that love will be one of the themes, and there will be a happy ending, and there will be no death. And out of Shakespeare's tragic comedies, The Tempest is thought to have been the play that Shakespeare wrote last in his career. So that this was an opportunity for him to basically say goodbye to the literary world and to his audience before he retired. And the tempest means a storm, and that is a literal and both a figurative meaning, as we oftentimes see with Shakespeare, that with the tempest that we have in the beginning of the plot a storm, and that storm happens to lead to the shipwreck and to the seemingly survival of the individuals on board on separate parts of an island. And that tempest was created in part through magic. So this is a play that is going to be incorporating fairies and witches, and we've seen both. We saw fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream, and we saw witches in Macbeth. The fairies are supposed to represent more positive, and then the witches, or the offspring of witches, should be something that's more negative. And then, of course, the tempest that occurs on the island is as these different characters, not realizing that the other characters are alive because they've all been shipwrecked and have survived on different parts of the island. So they believe that their particular community is the only community that survived. The tempest they have with each other, the storms that they have with each other. The main character is named Prospero, and he's supposed to represent a kind of Shakespeare character. The plot in the beginning of the play is that Prospero has spent, or had spent, too much time attending to his studies and his books, which were oftentimes focused on magic, rather than attending to his kingdom. So his kingdom was stolen by his brother. And instead of his brother killing him, and we talked a little bit about this with Richard II, the difficulty when you have a political rival, of what do you do with them? Do you kill them and then you risk the wrath of the populace? Do you imprison them, but then then you also risk the possibility of something like escape or the idea of some sort of an uprising. There is really no good way to go about this. But instead of killing Prospero, what they ended up doing was putting him on a raft with his daughter to basically perish at sea. And he, instead of perishing at sea, ended up eventually finding an island, a magical island that was inhabited both by fairies and also by creatures, one in particular named Caliban, who is thought to have been the product of a witch. And because Prospero has magical abilities through his studies, he's able to use and manipulate both those worlds to control them. And while he's on the island, his daughter grows up into a beautiful woman. And it just so happens, we have to suspend a little bit of disbelief, that all of Prospero's enemies are all on one ship. And basically that's because they're going to attend a wedding, and that ship is going to be passing near the island that Prospero shipwrecked on. So through magic and creating a tempest, he's able to capsize that ship so that ultimately everyone on the ship can find their way to the island on different parts of the island, and then Prospero can enact his revenge. But ultimately, at the end, since this is a tragic comedy, with the focus here on comedy, there has to be a happy ending in the sense that no one has died, and that ultimately there is going to be some resolution. And the resolution is that Prospero is able to regain back his kingdom and basically show the others the errors of their ways, as well as marry off his daughter. So this has oftentimes been viewed as a kind of farewell to the audience, not just Prospero saying goodbye at the ending of the play, almost like Puck said goodbye at the ending of the play in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But this could also be seen as a kind of Prospero saying goodbye to us as audience at the ending of the play. And this can be Shakespeare's last hurrah, so to speak, as he says goodbye, closing off his career in effect. And I wanted to read to you, if I can find that particular scene, the epilogue that's spoken by Prospero at the very ending. And this is at the ending of Act 5, Scene 1 in the epilogue. And what Prospero says is, "Now my charms are all overthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true, I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardon the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it ascends, mercy itself, and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free." And I remember very clearly hearing this speech in college and our Shakespeare professor reading that. And this would be the last few moments of class at the very ending of the semester, and say to us, his students, "And let your indulgence set me free." And dramatically close his book and walk out the door. So it's a wonderful way for putting closure to the semester as well, though I'm sort of stealing that from him. And obviously there's a lot of themes that we don't have time to talk about in terms of The Tempest. But if you're curious about the play and you think you have the energy and the time to read it before our final exam, you can earn a little bit of extra credit. You can either submit in a journal for The Tempest, and that would earn you a little bit of extra credit. And I will also on the final exam put an additional question about The Tempest that can earn you up to 10 extra credit points if you'd so like. in terms of that. You don't have to respond to that question or read The Tempest at this point. The best way to study for the final is just to review everything that we've talked about in class, the attendance questions, both your responses and my answers, but also your classmates as well, because then you'll get a richer sense of how the entire class would have felt about a particular idea. The videos, the first paper, and also the journals. Keep in mind that the exam is open book, open notes, and while you have 24 hours to do that exam, if we were doing it in person, you would have approximately 2 hours, no more than 3. So that's the kind of time and effort that I'm expecting that you put into it. So obviously your writing isn't going to be as neat or as polished as anything that you would do for something like a paper. I just want to make sure that you can sort of synthesize everything. And even for something like The Tempest, if you don't have the opportunity to read it, you can probably guess already what some of the themes might be based on the plays that we've already read. So in other words, Prospero is a very complex character. He's someone we're supposed to sympathize with, but he also controls and manipulates. Specifically, he's controlling and manipulating not just the people on the island, but also the supernatural beings on the island, the fairies, and also Caliban as well. And this is something we've seen with other characters, that they're supposed to be good, and Oberon is a good example of this in Midsummer Night's Dream, but yet also very controlling and manipulating as well. So we can see multifaceted sides here. Caliban is a particularly interesting character, if you're curious, because he's supposed to be this base entity that is the product of a witch, and yet he has some of the most beautiful poetry in the play. And again, we've seen this as well, and we saw this in something like, again, plays where we would expect lower level characters, for instance, like gardeners in Richard II, not to have eloquence, and in fact, what we find is that they have both insight and eloquence, a way for Shakespeare to sort of subvert the idea of the chain of being, and that you don't necessarily need to have position in order to be able to have a certain level of sophistication of intellect or understanding of the world. And Caliban, and while he's a very disagreeable character in many respects, he also is a very sympathetic character in many respects. And at one point he says, you know, what my profit on it, you're coming to this island, is that you taught me how to curse. And in other words, that Prosperous taught him language. And oftentimes the play is read as a kind of commentary on the idea of colonialism and conquering populations onto native lands, and taking and controlling the land and the people and forming them into their own image, in this instance represented by Caliban. So in other words, the Tempest has a lot of really interesting points, and once again some interesting political points that perhaps seem rather contemporary, and also that seem to be rather surprising considering the time period in which Shakespeare was writing. So I hope, if you don't have time to do The Tempest for our particular class, that would be the next play that you decide to tackle on your own. And I hope we've had enough experience with Shakespeare and Renaissance language, starting with the sonnets, don't forget the sonnets after all, and then finally ending with Othello and everything in between, that you have some facility for the language so that you could begin to read and watch Shakespeare on your own and begin to have some understanding and appreciation for it. So the last thing I just wanted to mention to you is the LAE, or the Liberal Arts English option, which you may or may not be aware of. But if you are getting a liberal arts degree, you know that there are quite a few electives from which you can choose. And if you wanted to get a liberal arts degree that's focused on English, a particular discipline, the bulk of those electives would be focused on 200 level English classes, much like this one. 6 exactly, if you wanted to take them. But even if you didn't complete all 6, let's say you did 3 or 4, you can always use them as electives for just your typical liberal arts degree. So, but if you are a fan of literature classes and you're thinking about taking other literature classes in the future, I just wanted to let you know which literature classes I will be teaching in the summer and the fall. For summer 1, I will be teaching English 247, which happens to be Women in Lit 1. That'll be an online class delivered much like this format. And for the fall, I will be teaching English 229, which happens to be Gothic literature. And also that is in an online format and very similar to this one. So Women in Literature 1 talks about female authors in England in the 1800s, and Gothic literature gives a overview of the Gothic tradition, starting with classics like Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then moving to contemporary times. If you have any questions about those, please let me know. So I wanted to thank you for making it through this far in a very challenging semester and a very challenging year. I very much look forward to the time that we can all meet in person. I'm assuming that'll happen sooner rather than later. But again, thank you for being adaptable and flexible during these challenging times. And we're almost at the end. The only thing that's left is our upcoming final exam. So I hope you're well. I'm doing well. And I will post the final exam on Monday. Take care. Bye bye.